So let's get started. Okay. Martha Ackman is a journalist and an author who writes about women who have changed America. Her essays and columns have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times. She is also a frequent commentator for New England Public Radio and has been featured on CNN, National Public Radio, and the BBC. Martha's award-winning books include The Mercury 13, The True Story of 13 Women and the Dream of Spaceflight, Curveball, The Remarkable Story of Toni Stone, first woman to play professional baseball in the Negro League, and now These Fevered Days. A longtime member of the Gender Studies Department of Mount Holyoke College, which she told us she just retired 4 years ago, Martha taught a popular seminar on Emily Dickinson in the Poet's House in Amherst, Massachusetts for nearly 2 decades. This book has grown out of that work. The book is receiving rave reviews. It has been called a remarkably refreshing account of one of America's finest poets, and another review says, the reclusive American poet emerges vividly in an imaginative examination of her life. I'm so grateful to Professor Ackman for making time to spend with us this evening and for virtually hanging out with us. And I will now switch over and put the spotlight on her and welcome Martha Ackman.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are making time in your day or your evening, I guess day out in Arizona and evening for all of us here on the East Coast. I really appreciate it. You know, I was 3 stops into a 22 city book tour when the virus hit and everything got shut down. So for several weeks right after that happened, I didn't think we'd be able to do any kind of connecting. So thank goodness for technology these days. I'm sure that all of you are connecting with family and friends that way too. But it's been I've been very, very grateful to bookstores and museums and other places where I had hoped to be to welcome me virtually. I'm very happy to be here. Lynn and I had a little bit of an email exchange this afternoon, and Lynn asked me if I'd like to read a poem, and I said, sure. You know, there are 1,789 Emily Dickinson poems that we know of. You know, who knows if there are still some out there that haven't been found. I believe that. I think there are poems that we haven't discovered. So there are a lot to choose from, and because Dickinson published posthumously, that her poetry was largely discovered after her death. We have everything that she wrote, and what I mean by that is the good, bad, and the ugly. You know, maybe some poems that she didn't think were so great, as well as others that she was quite proud of and for reason to be. So anyway, I chose Dickinson, one of Dickinson's shortest poems. Dickinson did not title her poems, only did that for about 10 out of nearly 2,000. But this is the shortest and actually one of my favorite. And I think that it really gets at a lot of the genius that was Emily Dickinson. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and 1 bee. 1 clover and a bee and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. I love that poem. I love the way it pivots on that word reverie. Well, let me tell you in these 20-25 minutes of me talking initially, let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. Both what the genesis of it was, a little bit about the conceit. It is not a cradle-to-grave biography. It doesn't purport to be. Focuses on 10 specific days, and then a little bit about my sources for the book, and maybe a word or two about my method of composition, and then we'll get to the fun part, and that'll be your questions. As Lynn mentioned, I taught a seminar on Emily Dickinson every Tuesday afternoon from 1 to 4 in Emily Dickinson's house. Montreal College, where I taught for many years, is just over the notch, as we call it, just over the mountain from Amherst, Massachusetts, where Emily Dickinson was born and spent her days and died. And the whole valley around us here is connected by a free bus service. So for students, like Montreal students who wanted to get to Amherst, it was an easy jaunt on the bus to get over to Emily Dickinson's house. Let me tell you how I happened to be, came to be teaching there. I remain very good friends with the directors of the Emily Dickinson Museum, which includes the homestead, as it's called, the home where Dickinson was born and died, and then the house next door, the Evergreens, which was the home of her brother Austin and her sister-in-law Sue Dickinson. So the museum actually has two properties. And I'm always over there and talking to my friends who run the museum. And in the 90s, I said, have you ever thought about having a class come in here? And they're always game for something. And so they said, well, yeah, that would be great. Let's see if we can put it together. The only day that the museum was closed, at least then, was on Tuesdays, closed to tourists. So we tried it out, and we met primarily in a room right across from Emily Dickinson's bedroom, and I had 10 students around a seminar table. I could only take 10 because that's how many who literally fit in a bedroom. And we had a free reign of the house. And I can't tell you how wonderful that was. I always say that teaching that seminar for so many years was not heavy lifting for a teacher, for a professor. And that's because the walls did everything. I mean, to be able to be right in Emily Dickinson's world and see out her windows, and because Dickinson was a recluse for the majority of her life, that perspective, those rooms were enormously important. I'll never forget when I would teach Dickinson's great poem, There Is a Certain Slant of Light, Winter Afternoons. And I tried to time the teaching of that poet to November, December, when I knew there would be that sharp angle of light in her bedroom where she wrote. And it was really a breathtaking experience, I think, for my students, and one that they'll always remember. Just another example of the way that the walls talked, as it were. One semester, the museum was doing some extensive reconstruction of Emily Dickinson's bedroom, trying to get it exactly, or as close as they could, to the way it looked during Dickinson's life, and especially the peak years of her literary productivity, which was 1861 to 65, roughly the parameters of the Civil War. So we'd be there, and we'd see workmen scraping away at the wallpaper and doing other kind of work in the bedroom. And one day they were taking down the molding around the top of the bedroom, and there they discovered layers of wallpaper that was not like the wallpaper that was in the bedroom then. So preservationists came in, and they were able to peel away and scrape away at, I think they were 3 or 4 layers of wallpaper, until they got down to a final layer that they were able to date scientifically, and they figured that it was probably from Dickinson's later years, from probably 1870, 1880, something like that. So they were delighted with that find, and they were able to reconstruct that wallpaper, to redesign it, to find out where it was done initially, and so to put up what was authentically surrounding Dickinson. It came as a shock to me. I had to do a kind of reset, because for years and years and years, as long as I had been in that museum and that house, the wallpaper was a kind of white flocked, and it suited one of the many, many myths about Emily Dickinson as this kind of sterile, austere, moth-like figure. But suddenly when we saw this wallpaper that was roses and lots of green. It made you kind of think in a different way. It was so vibrant. That's a very long story to say. And it's also the cover of my book. So we, when we were trying to, we were doing designs of the cover of the book, we looked at many things. And then we finally just settled on, the wallpaper. And those of you who have copies, you might look carefully. It has little dashes throughout it, and which is kind of evocative of Dickinson's favorite form of punctuation, which was the dash. Well, anyway, in teaching this course for so many years, I discovered that my students sort of came alive when I wrapped the day's lesson around a particular moment in Emily Dickinson's life. For example, when we were reading Dickinson's many poems about faith and religion and her questions to God and about God, I would wrap that day's lesson about around a moment when Dickinson was 17 and went head to head with the founder of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary at that time, very formidable woman by the name of Mary Lyon. And it was those moments when I saw that the students seemed to not only come alive, but kind of understand more deeply, make interesting connections, always cognizant of the fact that Dickinson was not writing autobiography. She was not writing about this moment with Mary Lyon, but nevertheless, lives inform art, and they liked making that connection. So being aware of the way that they kind of lit up made an impression upon me. I had been trying for years to come up with a kind of a way to write an Emily Dickinson book. I write narrative nonfiction. I'm not an academic writer. I write narrative nonfiction. I use the techniques of storytelling to tell a true story. And it occurred to me that if my students kind of snap to with this idea of focusing on a particular moment in Emily Dickinson's life, could I extend that technique, that approach, that conceit throughout an entire book? So I began thinking about that and trying to come up with 10 days that were pivotal, transformative for Emily Dickinson, and days that were chronological but not consecutive, but that would span her life in a way so that a reader could get a sense of her evolution as a poet. I also spoke with a number of friends of mine who are Emily Dickinson scholars and had them weigh in on all of this, and everybody had an opinion. Everybody had some notion of what the 10 days should be. Usually, 3 or 4 of them we all agreed upon, but then the rest were kind of up for debate. And I think that's one of the fun aspects of this book, is that it does kind of make you think, well, which might I have chosen if you have spent some time thinking and studying Emily Dickinson? Or I've also had lots of people in these talks that I've been giving say, well, it's kind of prompted me to think about what would be the 10 days that I would choose for my own life when something happened. So I came up with 10 days. They're not definitive. They're my 10 days. They're the days that make the most sense to me. And I went to work. I am somebody who loves archives. I am just about the happiest I ever can be in an archive when I'm going through old letters and diaries and journals and newspaper articles. And lucky for me that I live just 6 miles north of Amherst and have the great advantage of the archives at Mount Holyoke College to look at that year that Dickinson spent there when she was a teenager. Spent a lot of time at the Amherst College archives looking at all sorts of things related to the town of Amherst. I wanted to make the town of Amherst alive. It was so important to Dickinson. I wanted readers to get a sense of that. One of the I guess it's the strangest resources that I used is that Amherst College has this weather journal that was kept by Ebenezer Snell, which is, you know, a wonderful name. Of course, I had to use that. But Ebenezer Snell was the first graduate of Amherst College and later taught there for many, many years in mathematics and science departments. And he was a weather nut. And for about 40 years of his life, he kept this huge leather-bound journal. Actually, there were several volumes of it, where 4 times a day he would record the weather in Amherst. He lived just down the road from Dickinson. And so I thought that weather would provide a very kind of quotidian sense of what these days were like. So for every chapter, I include Ebenezer Snell's weather report for that day to give, you know, as much of a sense of verisimilitude about these moments as I possibly could. I should also mention about that weather journal. After Ebenezer Snell died, it was kept by his daughter. And then it was taken over by the University of Massachusetts for a while, and then later to Amherst College. Anyway, it is one of the longest continuing accounts of weather and therefore climate change that we have in this country. It's not just this kind of eccentric little thing, but it really is quite a remarkable document. So I tried to, thinking about sources, I also wanted to give readers a sense of the texture and the sight and the sounds of Emily Dickinson's world. And there was I start one chapter after she was in Boston being treated for an eye disorder. The first thing she wanted to do when she finally got home was to go up into the attic and read Shakespeare aloud. She had been forbidden from reading because it was too much of a strain on her eyes when she was in Boston. So I called up my friends at the Emily Dickinson Museum and said, can I get up into the attic? I want to get a good sense of what the light was like there. I wanted to read Shakespeare myself up there to see what it might sound like. So I had the great advantage of living here and living here for so long. I've been a resident of the Amherst area for over 40 years. And I wanted to bring all that to bear in trying to paint Dickinson's world as vibrantly as I possibly could. I'll just say one more thing before I shut up here and hear your questions. Every writer is different in the way they organize material and begin to put pen to paper, begin to knock away at a computer. For me, I have to work from just voluminous notes. And so I kept all of my notes for each chapter in these kind of spiral bound copies. And so this is one I just picked up off of my out of my files for chapter 10. And what's in here is every letter that Emily Dickinson wrote between the last chapter that I wrote, chapter 9 and chapter 10. It's all of the weather reports. It's every secondary source that dealt with that particular moment in Emily Dickinson's life. For this one, for chapter 10, I wanted, it's the day that Dickinson dies. I wanted to know what the night sky looked like on that particular evening. So I have notes that the man who runs the planetarium at Amherst College gave me when he projected the night sky onto the ceiling of the planetarium. So let's see what this is. This, for chapter 10, it's 140 pages of notes. And I just keep reading and reading and reading and reading those notes until I've almost memorized them. And then I get a sense of the narrative structure for the chapter. So it's always a case of boiling it down, boiling it down, boiling it down. I think it was Hemingway who had said something about writing is like looking at an iceberg. You know, you only see the top of it, and what's beneath it is about 10 times that. So that very much applies to the way that I approach my work as well. I've got to have much, 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 much more material than I could ever get into a chapter. And I think one of the hallmarks of good writing, what I aspire to, is that is that you want to choose judiciously. You want to have the most evocative details, but you've got to have all that other stuff in your head to shed light on what is most important. So that's my clock here says 7:26. I should probably pause here a moment, and then Lynn, you're going to take it over and
Sure.
start to generate some questions here.
I will. I'm going to invite people now to raise their hands or chat, send me a question in the chat. And while they're doing that, Martha, I'm going to throw a question at you.
All right, sure.
Do I remember reading somewhere that you actually sat at her desk to write?
Yes and no. Not at her desk. They would have thrown me out as well. They should have. And it's actually not Emily Dickinson's desk. It's a facsimile of one. Her desk is at the Houghton Library at Harvard, and you have to it's under lock and key. You have to make all sorts of arrangements to see it. So no, I didn't sit at her desk, but I did write in her bedroom at a card table. With my laptop there. I wanted to hear things. I wanted to know the train station is just a block from Emily Dickinson's house. Her father brought the train to Amherst in the 1860s and 1870s. So I wanted to know if I could hear footsteps on the staircase. I wanted to see the angle of light. What it looked like at 4 o'clock when the sun is beginning to set on winter afternoons, and she had windows that faced the west and face the north. So I did write there. People have asked me if I've kind of communed with the spirit of Emily Dickinson. No, that didn't happen to me. Maybe I'm not the type of person for that to happen to, but I certainly enjoyed being alone there and trying to witness as much of the sight and the sounds as I possibly could.
Sounds like a remarkable experience.
Yeah, and I, again, I took notes and notes and notes on what all that was, and a lot of it made its way into the book. I know there's chapter 10. I think begins with Emily Dickinson at her desk when she's in her later years and looking at night across the way to her brother's house. Her nephew had epilepsy and had terrible seizures where the family would rush to him. They didn't know exactly what was wrong at first, and the house would light up. And I wanted to know if a person sitting at a desk at night could see their reflections from the glass. And so I went to the homestead at night and tested all of that out. So I was really fortunate, to both live here and to have the generosity of that museum staff help me in so many ways.
That's fabulous. All right, well, we have a bunch of questions coming in here. The first is a comment from Ung saying, as an employee of the National Archives, I'm so glad to hear that you love using archives.
Yes, indeed. And let me sing the praises of archivists far and wide, because they really, really helped me. I used to teach a class at Mount Holyoke called The Art of Fact, and it was about using artifacts and working in archives. All my students had to choose a topic and then work in an archive to write a chapter. And one of the very important things I tried to stress upon them is the relationship between the researcher and the archivist. The more that the archivist knows about your project, the more that they can help you with it and bring you resources that you never thought that you never thought to ask for. So boy, do I love archivists, and thank you for that comment.
Okay, here's a question from Barbara. Can you give an example of a poem and the day it was written?
No,
okay.
Not at all, because Emily Dickinson didn't date her poems. Here's the tricky thing. As I said, Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 2,000 poems. She didn't date them. And the way that they are organized chronologically, most people use an edition done by R.W. Franklin, Ralph Franklin, who was the last to organize Dickinson's poems. They compare her handwriting to her letters that are dated. So it's a very slippery business about dating Dickinson's poems, but it's the only system we have for it. So we don't know, for example, we can date a poem to like 1862, but we don't know what particular day. She might have included that poem in a letter that she dates, but who knows if she wrote it 3 weeks before. So we can only be general about the dating, and always cognizant of the fact that we are not able to pinpoint it to a day. I have at least one chapter in the book, I think it's chapter 5, that focuses on the composition of her towering poem, Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers. And I have it pegged to a date, but that's the date that it was anonymously published in a newspaper. So you really can't say what day she wrote something.
Okay. Here's a question from Chris. Well, first, you're getting a compliment about your technique being analogous to Ken Burns' use of old photo extreme close-ups to bring scenes alive.
Yeah, that's nice. Thanks.
What do you understand of her mental state? Would she be considered agoraphobic today? And given her isolation from the world, how can we understand her rich imagination and connection to beauty and empathy?
Well, that's a biggie. Her Dickinson, from the time she was in her, I'd say 30s, became more and more reclusive. She once wrote, "I never crossed my father's ground to any house or town." People take that very literally and say, "Oh man, she didn't even go outside," and that is not the case. And she also had a big dog that she was a primary caregiver for. He was a Newfoundland. Most people think a big slobbering Newfoundland. She had to walk him a lot. So even taking that sentence at face value, "I never crossed my father's ground to any house or town," that was acres upon acres she had to roam. Nobody has a definitive answer as to why Dickinson became reclusive. Her younger sister Lavinia said it was just a happen. But she also, as I said, wasn't somebody who stayed in her bedroom the entire time. She brought the world into it. Dickinson's father was a lawyer, served one term in U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. She visited him in Washington, also spent some time in Philadelphia. Dickinson had class privilege. She also had race privilege. She was the daughter of an upper middle class family, so she did not have to work for a living. I often think of her and compare her to the Brontes, for example, 3 daughters of a poor minister in Yorkshire, and they die at 28 and 27, and after having rather arduous lives as governesses and trying to write on the side. Dickinson didn't have to work for a living. That is not to say that therefore she became the literary genius she was. She became a literary genius because it was in her. Part of that question was, I think, also about like where did it come from? Dickinson once famously, it was I think one of the most emphatic things she ever said in her life, said about her poetry. She said, "When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person." So she was always arguing for the primacy of imagination, and saying that one need not have lived an experience to write about it. So where does Dickinson's genius come from? I think it came from the well of her imagination. And I think she chose to spend time alone, to seek solitude, so that she could devote the full intensity of that imagination to her art. Nothing was more important to her.
Thank you. The next comment and question is, I'm a Presbyterian minister who taught with Lou Mudge at McCormick Theological
Oh, my
Seminary in
goodness. Yeah.
Chicago, and was friends with Lou and Jean, who lived with their family in Emily's house. This person wonders, Jarvis, I don't know the first name, wonders if you knew Jean and if you were influenced by her own writing about living in the house.
Yeah. Oh, I'm delighted to get that question. Let me tell you a story. When I was 20, I'm a native Missourian. I went to college in Missouri, and I already was fascinated by Emily Dickinson, and was writing a college thesis on Emily Dickinson, and there was an exchange. I could take part in an exchange with a little college, I think that even no longer exists, kind of down near Vassar, for a January term. And I came, and so I went there, and I took a course on New England poets or something. And one weekend, I can't remember, I hitchhiked to Amherst. I hitchhiked from like down near Poughkeepsie, New York, up to Amherst, because I wanted to see the Emily Dickinson house. And I wouldn't recommend this, but you know, the house at that time was owned by Amherst College. It still is today. It was only open a couple of hours a week. I didn't know that. I just knocked on the door. Jean Mudge let me in. And she must have seen me as this maybe crazy, but passionate young kid. She was so kind to me, and she gave me about an hour of her time, and showed me the Emily Dickinson bedroom. They were living there. I think they had young kids at the time. I never knew Luke, but I will always remember that kindness. And of course, I know the book that she wrote on Emily Dickinson's home, and thank goodness she opened that door for me.
Wow. Okay. John, we have a question you are going to ask yourself. Go ahead. Oh, we can't really see you.
I can see your head, John. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Well, hello, Professor.
Hi.
It's a real honor to talk to you. I loved your book. I absolutely
Thank
loved
you.
it. I've read about five books on Emily Dickinson, and yours really, I read White Heat about Thomas Higginson.
Mm-hmm.
Your book really brought her to life in ways that I thought I kind of had read all I needed to read about Emily Dickinson's life, but you brought it so alive. I mean, you gave a whole new dimension to her, to me.
Thank you.
I have so many questions I'd love to ask you. I guess one I would ask you is, one, are any of your courses online or preserved where you could listen to your courses?
Oh, that's very kind of you. No, just, you know, gone with the wind.
All right, then two, I get a second one since the answer is no.
John.
Are there any other books? What books would you recommend about Dickinson? Is there any one that maybe is undiscovered or not read by a lot of people? Or?
Well, so many.
That's not probably fair.
Am I?
I lost you.
You're good.
Okay. Should I keep talking?
Sure.
Okay. One book that a lot of people don't know about is called Made as Muse, and that's M-A-I-D, Made as Muse, by Aoife Murray. Aoife is A-I-F-E, and it looks at the Dickinsons through the perspective of their Irish domestics. And Aoife, a friend of mine, Aoife, really wanted to look at questions of class and immigration and what was happening at the house, inside the house. You know, from the maid's point of view, it's you know, it's not nonfiction. It's not historical fiction. But I think that's a really good book that a lot of people don't know about. And well, you mentioned White Heat. I think that's a really good angled look at Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the man who was her literary mentor. You know, if you're talking biography, when I taught Dickinson, I picked and chose things, and I still think Sewell is pretty good. He's pre-feminist, so there's not much in terms of Dickinson as a woman, looking at gender analysis there. But I still think that that gives a pretty good sense of her spirit. Maybe more so than some of the more contemporary biographies. But thank you for your kind comments about.
You're welcome, more than welcome.
And you know, one of the reasons why I took the approach I did, the conceit I did, was that I did want to really focus on bringing her to life, and I knew if I wrote a cradle to grave biography, I couldn't sustain that. So by focusing on 10 specific days, I could really crack those open in terms of what was happening in Amherst, what was happening in the country, what was happening with the war. But if I did that from, you know, age 0 to her death at 55, it would have been more history than narrative, not nonfiction, I think.
Okay, I want to make sure we get through all the rest of the questions. And the next one, I think you've in part addressed, especially with what you just said, but the next question is, how did you decide on which 10 days to focus on?
Some were absolute givens. The day that Dickinson wrote her, the most important letter in American literary history, a letter that she wrote to the man we've just been talking about, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a stranger and essayist for the Atlantic Monthly, and sent out of the blue, sent him 4 of her poems to take a look at. I knew I wanted to end on her death date because there's pretty good archival record on all of that. And then some of the others were just my favorites. For example, the book opens with Dickinson at 14. I knew I had to start with Dickinson as a girl. I wanted to do that. It's a letter she writes to a childhood friend and it ends with the phrase, "All things are ready." I just love that. I think it's metaphorically rich. I think it really evokes a sense of Dickinson's confidence. Another one that I loved is when she writes a letter to her cousins, and she says her cousin's name was Louisa. She called her Lou. She said, "Do you remember that October morning, Lou, when you and I sat in the dining room and decided to be distinguished? It's a great thing to be great, Lou." And I love that, again, because one of the themes that I really tried to advance in the book was Dickinson's sense of confidence and ambition. And so the days were a mix between ones that were absolutely givens and ones that were favorites of mine that I thought advanced some of the themes I wanted to put forward.
So sort of piggybacking on that question, you said you had talked to other scholars about which days they would pick. Is there a day that you picked that no one else would have picked?
Yeah, I think that first one that I mentioned, the all things are ready. I think the distinguished one, they may not have picked. I'll tell you one that I picked, but then I didn't use.
Oh.
You know, writers, unless you're Stephen King, you've always got to do a book proposal that your agent then shops around. And a book proposal always must contain a list of each chapter that you intend to write and summaries of it. And one of the chapters that I had intended to write was actually based on my dissertation from, a million years ago. And it was about these 2 cousins, Fanny and Lou Norcross, that I referenced earlier, who ended up living in Concord, Massachusetts, and were great and good friends with all the big Concord literati, with Emerson, with Bronson Alcott, with Louisa May Alcott, and they were part of a literary group, a select literary group that shared writings and writings of others that had not been published. And what do you know? There was a meeting when they shared some of Dickinson's poems with this clutch of about 12 people, including Emerson. And that flies in the face, of one of the many myths of Dickinson that said that nobody understood her, that she didn't have access to anybody who'd be able to help her get published. No, there's Emerson and Dickinson together. She wasn't at that meeting, but her work was. Well, nobody knows that little factoid except me and some Dickinson people. But I realized once I started writing the book that I couldn't write a chapter where her cousins are presenting her work to Emerson and she's not there. One of the kind of the rules that I had for myself is that Dickinson has to be on stage at least every third page. She couldn't be up in Amherst as she was. So then I realized I can't do this chapter. She's not going to be there. So I threw that out and I put in the chapter about Dickinson's eye problems and her living in Cambridge while she was being treated, and living in Cambridge when Lincoln was reelected and when Lincoln was assassinated. That's another thing. We think of her as so separate from history, and no, she was not.
That's so interesting. I'm glad you mentioned Alcott, because I thought of her when you talked about Dickinson not needing to earn a living.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, next question. In that Emily Dickinson, this is from Mark, wrote a lot about faith and religion. What were her religious sensibilities? Was she a seeker, a doubter, a believer, etc.?
Well, my chapter 2 in the book really deals with that, and I like the way you categorized her there. When Dickinson was a student at Mount Holyoke, Mary Lyon, the founder, asked students to self-identify themselves as those who had hope, meaning they professed that they believed in Christ. I mean, that it was a Protestant hope. Those who were on the bubble, and those who were no-hopers, who didn't really want to join the church. Mount Holyoke was not unique in this. Other colleges from Yale to Oberlin to Amherst all did a similar kind of thing. Well, Emily Dickinson was a no-hoper. And at the end of the college year, her year at Mount Holyoke, she remained one. Wasn't the only one. There was about, I think about 30% of them remained that. But a seeker, did she think about questions of faith? Oh yeah, all the time. Emily Dickinson was the only member of her family not to join the Congregational Church. But there was probably no one in her family who thought about questions of religion and faith and immortality more. So it was definitely one of her big themes.
Next question is, did she express an opinion about the Civil War?
I don't know quite what you mean about opinion, but well, she lived in the midst of it. And another thing that I really tried to do in the book was show that Amherst was not removed from the war. Even though it was up north, one of the most formative experiences of Dickinson's life was when a young man was killed, and he happened to be the son of the Amherst College president, kind of the heir apparent, the golden child of this small country town. And I think that there were many lessons to her in the war, most prominently that life is short, and that that we have to do what we want to do on this earth, and not delay. Her father was a Whig. He was by no means an ardent abolitionist. He was against slavery, but he saw abolitionists as taking things one step too far. But Dickinson was a absolutely loyal reader of the newspaper and the Atlantic Monthly. So she was very well informed about not only the political questions that the war prompted, but also about battles, and as I said, touched by death and the savagery of war. She lived, the homestead where she lived is about 3 blocks from the town common in Amherst, and she could hear soldiers mustering there as she was writing her poems. So Dickens, as I said earlier, Dickinson's greatest literary productivity, where she was writing almost a poem a day, was during the Civil War years. So rather than having cataclysmic events freeze her, you know, as I think happens to some people, that they, well, think of ourselves now, you know, how productive are some of us being. For Dickinson, they were fuel, and it prompted her to write even more.
Okay. Martha, we have 3 more questions here, and I think we have time to get through them. What do you make of, this is from Mary Lynn, what do you make of Gordon's assertions that she herself had epilepsy and that was why she left Mount Holyoke and became an at-home poet? Is there any credibility to that?
Yeah, Linda Gordon's book, Lives Like Loaded Gun, asserts this. And she makes that that case, and I love Linda Gordon's work, I should say that right up front. She makes that assertion primarily based on a metaphorical reading of Dickinson's poems. And I came across no evidence whatsoever of any medical support for the epilepsy theory. You can read her poems and see maybe something about that, but I don't ascribe to it. I just don't see any evidence for it. It's you know, you're on slippery ground when you're starting to read the poems metaphorically for evidence of something that factually happened in Dickinson's life. I think that's a shaky approach.
Okay. Now I know that you talk about a lot about this in the book, the question of what kind of education she experienced, and also who some of her favorite writers or poets were.
Well, she had a sterling education. She was very fortunate as a girl, going to school from about 1840 until 1850. First at her version of high school, Amherst Academy, and and then later at Mount Holyoke. And I'd say both places, both at Amherst Academy and at Mount Holyoke, girls were not shuttled into the fine arts, you know, that the only thing that they thought their minds were good for was painting or learning foreign languages. Both places, she had a really superior scientific education. In one of the letters that Dickinson wrote from Mount Holyoke, she writes to her brother, and she said, "I am all engrossed in the study of sulfuric acid." And she followed it with 5 exclamation points. So that keen eye to nature, that was very well schooled at Amherst Academy and at Mount Holyoke. In fact, Dickinson's first book, if you call it that, was an herbarium she kept as a girl, with flowers and leaves in it. And what was the second part of that question?
Who her favorite writers or poets were?
Favorite writers and poets, the Brontes, Shakespeare, absolutely. She loved fiction. She loved reading Dickens. She talks about the Brontes, and she read Melville. She loved Emerson. I have quite a bit in the book about Emerson, in part because I love Emerson so much too, at least his essays. There are books of Emerson's essays that she has underlined, particularly things that she's underlined about how a metaphor works. I was quite intrigued by that. So she was a voracious reader. And then add the newspaper to it. You know, I would never, when you talk about Dickinson's reading, you've got to insert the newspaper, because she loved that.
Okay, thank you. We have a welcome from Lisa Ben Shoshan, who's class of 83.
Oh, great.
And
here's my Mount Holyoke mug I'm drinking out of.
Awesome. And so we have our last question here, which I think is a perfect one to close on, which is to tell us about the title.
Oh, it wasn't the title that it was supposed to be. The title that it was supposed to be was Vesuvius at Home, which is another line from a Dickinson poem. And I like that sense of the explosion in a domestic setting at home. But there's a very famous essay by Adrienne Rich, written in the 1970s, one of the first feminist analysis of Dickinson's poems, called Vesuvius at Home. And thanks to Google, you know, every time you pick a title for a book, you've got to think about how it's going to come up on Google. And my agent and my editor said, you know, we're thinking that essay is going to come up first, and then your book will come up second. And so my editor said, can you think of a new title? And we need it tomorrow. And so I remember this was this winter day, and I got my book of Dickinson's poems, and I sat upstairs in our bedroom and just I started the beginning, and I stayed there that whole day and read every Dickinson poem, not for sense, but for, you know, I'd done that, of course, but as for titles. So I came up with a list of 9 that I thought might work, and These Fevered Days was number 9. And I thought, no, you know, maybe, and you know, titles should be about 3 words, 3-4 words, something like that. And then I slept on it, and I thought, no, that's got that same sensibility that I liked about Vesuvius at Home, that fire. Now, you know, you publish a book in February of 2020, you know, just weeks before COVID, and it's called These Fevered Days, and, you know, nope, that wasn't on my mind, let me tell you. It has a different ring to it now, but that's how I came up with it. It's a late poem. She wrote it pretty late in life.
It's a wonderful story. Well, I will ask you one more question, actually, which is, do you have a new book you're working on?
Well, I'm pubbing this one, you know, in these virtual ways, but I do. People tease me because my topics are so different. I write about astronauts and then baseball players and poets, and I'm going to be writing about Dolly Parton next. So I'm beginning to do some work on that. I was in Nashville last October when she did her 50th anniversary concert at the Grand Ole Opry, and you know, took notes as I always do. And like I said, I get teased about that a lot because my topics are so different. But I always think that I'm trying to get at what is America, and I think with Dolly, it's you know, she's an American original, and I want to take her seriously. I think she's not taken seriously too often, and she has something to say about that unique quality of American reinvention. So
Right.
that's where I'm headed.
That's wonderful. I think she's brilliant. And she says it takes a long time to become an overnight sensation.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, Martha, thank you so much for spending time with us here tonight. It was just
been my pleasure.
Wonderful.
And thank you all for coming out. And to my friends, Liz and Annie, who are over there someplace, and the Mount Holyoke alums, long may ye wave.
Thank you. Everybody's posting messages that says thank you so much. We're so grateful, and good luck with the rest of your virtual tour.
Thank you.
Buy the book, everybody. There's a link in the chat where you can buy the book, and I'll resend it in an email tomorrow.